The chains of Mercy Creek. The sun hung like a brass medallion against the cloudless Arizona sky when Jake Morrison first laid eyes on the auction block in Dusty Gulch. He'd ridden into town with nothing more than the clothes on his back, $37 in his pocket, and a burning desire to disappear into the vastness of the territory. The last thing he'd expected to find was a slave auction in 1884, 15 years after such things had supposedly ended. But there it was, plain as the nose on his weathered face. A crowd of rough-looking men had gathered around a makeshift platform constructed from old wagon boards. Standing atop it was a greasy-haired man in a faded purple vest, his voice carrying across the dusty street like the call of a carrion bird. "Now what am I bid for this here Mexican girl?" the auctioneer hollered, gesturing toward a figure that made Jake's blood run cold. She couldn't have been more than 16, maybe 17 years old. Her dark hair hung in matted tangles around a face that might have been pretty if not for the hollow exhaustion that dulled her brown eyes. But it wasn't her youth or her obvious suffering that made Jake's jaw clench tight enough to crack teeth. It was the chain. A heavy iron shackle encircled her ankle, connected to a thick chain that led down to where it was padlocked around the neck of a tired-looking mule. The beast stood with its head hanging low, as much a prisoner as the girl herself. "She's a hard worker, gentlemen," the auctioneer continued, his gold tooth glinting. "Knows her way around a kitchen, can mend and sew, and she ain't given to running off, as you can plainly see." The crowd chuckled at this, and Jake felt his hand drift unconsciously toward the Colt .45 holstered at his hip. He'd seen plenty of ugly things in his 34 years on this earth, had done a few himself that still haunted his dreams, but this spectacle stirred something in him that he'd thought long buried. $20, called out a man in a bowler hat. 25, shouted another. Jake studied the girl's face as the bidding continued. She wasn't looking at the crowd, her gaze was fixed on something far beyond the horizon, as if she could will herself to be anywhere but here. There was a dignity in her bearing despite her circumstances, a quiet strength that reminded him of someone he'd rather not remember. $30. "Do I hear 35? The auctioneer's voice grated against Jake's ears like fingernails on slate. He thought about the $37 in his pocket, money he'd planned to use for supplies before heading deeper into the wilderness, money that represented his freedom, his chance to start over where no one knew his name or his past. $35. The man in the bowler hat raised his hand again, a cruel smile playing at his lips. Jake had seen that look before, knew what it meant. His decision crystallized in that moment, clear and sharp as mountain air. $50. The words left his mouth before he'd fully realized he was going to speak them. Every head in the crowd turned toward him, taking in his dusty clothes, his sun-darkened skin, the way his right hand rested easy near his gun. $50, the auctioneer repeated, his eyes lighting up with greed. "Do I hear 55? The man in the bowler hat looked Jake up and down, seemed to weigh his chances in whatever contest this might become, and apparently decided they weren't good enough. He shook his head and stepped back. $50 once, $50 twice. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Sold to the gentleman in the black hat." Jake walked forward through the parting crowd, ignoring the curious stares and muttered comments. He counted out the bills, all but 7 of his dollars, and handed them to the auctioneer, who produced a key from his vest pocket. "Name's Ezra Polk," the man said, extending his hand. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Morrison." Jake didn't take the offered hand. The key. Polk's smile faltered slightly, but he handed over the key. "She's all yours, Morrison. Word of advice, keep that chain on her. These Mexican girls got a tendency to run." Jake pocketed the key without a word and walked over to where the girl stood beside the mule. Up close, he could see the angry red welts where the shackle had chafed her ankle, the way she held herself as if expecting a blow. When he knelt to unlock the chain around the mule's neck, she flinched away from him. "Easy," he said quietly, the same tone he might use with a spooked horse. "I'm not going to hurt you." She said nothing, but her dark eyes tracked his every movement as he freed the mule from its iron collar. The animal snorted and shook its head, as if trying to understand this sudden change in circumstances. Jake straightened up and looked at the girl. "What's your name?" For a long moment she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Elena, Elena." He tried the name, found it sat well on his tongue. "I'm Jake Morrison." She nodded once, a tiny acknowledgement that said everything and nothing. Jake glanced around at the crowd, which was beginning to disperse now that the show was over. The man in the bowler hat was lingering nearby, watching them with obvious interest. Others were doing the same, and Jake felt the familiar itch between his shoulder blades that meant trouble was brewing. "We're leaving," he told Elena. "Can you walk?" She nodded again, though he noticed she favored her left leg, the one with the shackles still locked around her ankle. Jake led his horse over from the hitching post where he'd left it, a sturdy bay gelding named Cisco that had carried him faithfully for the past 3 years. He swung up into the saddle and offered Elena his hand. "Up behind me." She hesitated, glancing back at the mule that stood forgotten beside the auction block. "What about?" she started to say. "The mule stays," Jake said firmly. "Come on." Elena took his hand and let him pull her up behind him. She settled onto the horse's back as lightly as a bird, her small hands gripping his belt. Jake could feel her trembling, whether from fear, exhaustion, or the desert cold that was already starting to creep in with the setting sun, he couldn't tell. He nudged Cisco into motion, guiding the horse down the main street of Dusty Gulch at an easy walk. Behind them, the mule let out a plaintive bray that seemed to echo off the false-fronted buildings like a lament. They were maybe 100 yards from the edge of town when Jake heard the sound of hoofbeats behind them. He didn't need to look back to know what it meant. Someone had decided that $50 wasn't enough compensation for letting a prize like Elena slip away. "Hold tight," he murmured over his shoulder and felt Elena's grip on his belt tighten. Jake spurred Cisco into a gallop, heading for the broken country beyond the town limits. The desert opened up before them like a promise of freedom, all red rock and endless sky. Behind them, the pursuit was gaining ground. He counted at least 4 riders, maybe 5. "Where are we going?" Elena called out, her voice nearly lost in the thunder of hoofbeats. "Away from here," Jake replied, leaning low over Cisco's neck as they pounded across the hardpan. A gunshot cracked behind them, the bullet whining overhead like an angry bee. Then another, closer this time. Jake cursed under his breath and angled toward a cluster of red rock formations about a mile ahead. If they could reach cover, they might have a chance. More shots rang out, one of them close enough that Jake felt the wind of its passage. Cisco was running flat out now, his breath coming in great snorts, foam flying from his mouth. The horse was giving everything he had, but the pursuers were closing the distance. They reached the rocks with maybe 50 yards to spare. Jake pulled Cisco up hard behind a boulder the size of a small house and vaulted down from the saddle. He helped Elena down, then slapped Cisco's rump to send the horse deeper into the maze of stone formations. "Stay down," he told Elena, drawing his Colt, "and stay quiet." She crouched behind a smaller rock, the chain around her ankle making a soft clinking sound as she moved. Jake grimaced. That noise would give them away if anyone got close enough to hear it. The riders were upon them moments later. Jake counted 4 men, all armed, all looking like the kind of hard cases who wouldn't hesitate to shoot a man in the back. The one in the lead was the man in the bowler hat from the auction. "Morrison," the man called out, "we know you're in there. Come on out and bring the girl, and nobody has to get hurt." Jake said nothing, checking the loads in his pistol. 6 shots, and there were 4 of them. He'd faced worse odds, but not often. "You made a mistake, Morrison," Bowler Hat continued. "That girl belongs to certain parties who don't take kindly to having their property stolen. Property's got papers." Jake called back. "You got papers on her? Don't need papers for her kind," another voice shouted. "Now quit wasting our time and send her out." Jake peered around the edge of his boulder. The men had spread out, trying to surround the rock formation. In a few minutes, they'd have him pinned down with no way out, unless he looked back at Elena, who was watching him with those dark, frightened eyes. The chain around her ankle caught the last rays of sunlight, and an idea began to form in his mind. "Elena," he whispered, "that chain, how strong is it?" She looked down at the iron links. "Very strong, senor. I tried many times to break it." "Not break it," Jake said. "Use it." He explained his plan quickly, and saw understanding dawn in her eyes. She nodded once, then began working her way deeper into the rocks, moving as quietly as she could despite the chain. Jake waited until she was in position, then stepped out from behind his boulder with his hands raised. "All right," he called out. "You win. I'm coming out." The 4 men emerged from their various hiding places, guns drawn but lowered slightly. Bowler Hat had a satisfied smirk on his face. "Smart choice, Morrison. Now where's the girl?" "Right here," Elena said from behind them. The men spun around, and that's when Elena swung the chain like a whip. 3 feet of heavy iron links caught the nearest gunman across the face, dropping him like a stone. Jake drew and fired in the same instant, putting a bullet through Bowler Hat's shoulder and spinning him around. The other 2 men were bringing their guns up when Jake's second and third shots took them down. He was already moving, rolling behind another rock as return fire chipped stone all around him. Bowler Hat was cursing and trying to aim his pistol left-handed when Elena appeared behind him again. This time she wrapped the chain around his throat and pulled tight. "Drop the gun," she said in perfect English, all trace of accent gone from her voice. The man's eyes bulged as he struggled against the chain. His pistol fell from nerveless fingers as he clawed at his throat. "Elena," Jake said quietly, "that's enough." She held the chain tight for another few seconds, then released it. Bowler Hat fell to his knees, gasping and coughing. "The others?" Jake asked. Elena checked the 3 men she'd helped bring down.
2 dead. This one will live, but he won't be riding anywhere for a while. Jake nodded and knelt beside Bowler Hat, who was still struggling to breathe. He grabbed the man by his collar and hauled him to his feet. "You're going to ride back to town," Jake told him. "You're going to tell whoever sent you that Elena Vasquez is under my protection now. You understand?" The man nodded frantically. "Good, because if I see you or any of your friends again, I won't be in such a charitable mood." Jake shoved him toward his horse. Bowler Hat stumbled over to the animal and managed to climb into the saddle, still holding his wounded shoulder. He rode off without looking back, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Elena was standing beside the bodies of the 2 dead men, looking down at them with an expression Jake couldn't read. "You've done this before," he observed. "See," she met his eyes. "I was not always a slave, Senor Morrison." "Jake," he corrected. "And I had that figured out when you suddenly started talking like you went to finishing school." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "I did, actually, in San Antonio, before the bandits came." Jake walked over to where Cisco was waiting patiently among the rocks. The horse nickered softly as he approached, apparently none the worse for their adventure. "We should get moving," Jake said. "There might be more of them." "Where will we go?" It was a good question. Jake had been planning to head north into the high country, maybe find some isolated valley where he could build a cabin and disappear from the world. But those plans had been made for one person, not 2. "There's a mission about 20 miles from here," he said finally. "Padre Miguel runs it. He's a good man. He'll help you." Elena was quiet for a long moment. "And you? I'll get you there safe. After that," he shrugged, "after that you're free to go where you want. And the chain." Jake pulled the key from his pocket and tossed it to her. "Your choice." Elena caught the key and looked down at the shackle around her ankle. Her fingers trembled slightly as she inserted the key and turned it. The iron band fell away with a soft click, leaving behind an angry red welt on her dark skin. She stood there for a moment, staring down at the discarded shackle. Then she drew back her foot and kicked it as hard as she could, sending it clattering across the rocks. "Bastardo," she spat, and Jake had to suppress a smile. They mounted up and rode through the night, stopping only to rest the horse and share water from Jake's canteen. Elena had grown quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now, thoughtful rather than fearful. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jake spotted the mission bell tower in the distance. San Miguel de los Santos sat in a green valley watered by a small spring, its adobe walls glowing warm in the morning light. "There," Jake said, pointing. "You'll be safe there." Elena looked toward the mission, then back at him. "What about you? Where will you go?" "North. Find some place quiet to build a cabin, maybe raise some cattle." He paused. "What about you? Got family somewhere?" "All dead," she said it matter-of-factly, but Jake heard the old pain underneath. "The bandits who took me, they burned my village, killed everyone who fought back. I'm sorry. It was 3 years ago. I have learned to live with it." They rode down into the valley as the mission bells began to ring for morning prayers. Padre Miguel emerged from the chapel as they approached, a short, round man with kind eyes and work-hardened hands. "Senor Morrison," he called out in accented English, "what brings you to us this morning?" Jake had met the priest a year ago when he'd stopped at the mission for supplies. Miguel was one of the few people in the territory who knew something of Jake's past and had never judged him for it. "Morning, Padre." Jake dismounted and helped Elena down. "I was hoping you might have room for one more." Miguel's eyes took in Elena's torn dress, her bare feet, the red mark around her ankle where the shackle had been. His face darkened. "Of course, child," he said to Elena in Spanish. "You are welcome here for as long as you need." "Gracias, Padre," Elena replied, "but I do not wish to be a burden." "Nunca," Miguel assured her. "Never. Come, Sister Maria will find you food and clean clothes." Elena looked back at Jake one more time. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Jake touched the brim of his hat. "Take care of yourself, Elena." He was turning to go when her voice stopped him. "Jake," he looked back. "The mule," she said. "You left the mule." "I know. Why?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, thinking about chains and freedom, and the weight of the past. "Sometimes you gotta leave something behind to move forward," he said finally. Elena nodded slowly, understanding flickering in her dark eyes. Jake mounted Cisco and rode away without looking back, heading north toward the mountains, and whatever new life waited for him there. Behind him the mission bells continued to ring, their bronze voices carrying across the desert, like a benediction. He made camp that evening beside a small creek, the same creek where he'd be building his cabin within the month. As he sat by his fire watching the stars come out, Jake found himself thinking about chains, the ones that bound people, and the ones that bound memories. He'd left more than a mule behind in Dusty Gulch. He'd left behind the man who could have walked away from that auction, who could have turned a blind eye to suffering because it wasn't his fight. Maybe that man had needed to stay chained to his past, but Jake Morrison was ready to be free. 3 days later, as he was laying the foundation for his cabin, Jake heard hoofbeats approaching. He looked up to see Elena riding toward him on a small paint mare, dressed in simple traveling clothes with a bedroll and supplies tied behind her saddle. "Afternoon," she called out as she drew rein near his worksite. "Elena." Jake straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Thought you were staying at the mission." "I was, for a while." She dismounted and looked around at the half-built cabin, the cleared ground, the creek running clear and cold nearby. Padre Miguel said you might need help. Did he now? See, he said a man living alone in the wilderness might appreciate someone who knows how to cook and mend and tend a garden. She paused. He also said you might be too stubborn to ask for help even if you needed it. Jake couldn't help but smile at that. Padre Miguel's got a big mouth. He also has a good heart, like someone else I know. They stood there for a moment, measuring each other across the space between them. Finally, Jake gestured toward the unfinished cabin. It's going to be a hard life up here, he said. Cold winters, long summers, not much company except what we make ourselves. I know about hard lives, Elena replied. I also know about freedom. It wouldn't be proper, you and me living up here alone. Padre Miguel thought of that too. Elena reached into her saddlebags and pulled out a small leather-bound book. He gave me this to study, said when I felt ready, he'd perform the ceremony. Jake looked at the prayer book, then at Elena's face. That's a big decision. I've had 3 years to think about it. 3 years of being owned by other people, having no choice in anything. She met his eyes steadily. Now I'm free to choose, and I choose this. I choose you. Why? Because you bought a girl who was chained to a mule, then rode away leaving the mule behind. Elena smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it reached all the way to her eyes. Because you understand that sometimes you have to leave something behind to move forward. Jake looked at his half-built cabin, at the woman standing beside her horse in the afternoon sunlight, at the future spreading out before them like the vast Arizona sky. He thought about chains and freedom, about the things that bound people and the things that set them free. Well, he said finally, I reckon I could use some help with the roof. Elena's smile widened. I thought you might. They worked together until sunset, laying beams and fitting boards, building something new from the ground up. As the stars came out over their valley, they sat by the fire sharing coffee and making plans for tomorrow. Neither of them looked back toward Dusty Gulch, where a tired old mule still wandered the streets, finally free but somehow lost without the weight of chains to guide him home. Some prisons, Jake reflected, were harder to escape than others. But he and Elena had found the key to theirs, and they weren't planning on looking back. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, and the sound seemed less lonely than it had before. The wilderness was still vast and often harsh, but it no longer felt empty. Jake Morrison had finally found something worth more than solitude, a future built on choice rather than circumstance, freedom rather than fear. And if that future happened to include a woman who could swing a chain like a weapon and had the courage to choose love over safety, well, that just made it all the sweeter. The mule they'd left behind might never understand why it had been abandoned, but Elena and Jake knew the truth. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is cut the chains, even if it means stepping into the unknown. They'd chosen each other, chosen this place, chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes of their separate sorrows. And in the years to come, as their cabin grew into a ranch, and their love grew into a family, they would never regret the day Jake Morrison paid $50 for a girl in chains, and then rode away leaving the mule behind. Because sometimes the best thing you can leave behind is exactly what everyone expects you to keep.